Luxembourg as a country had iron ore reserves which could be easily attracted and which made the country's steel industry extremely competitive on a global basis. And then the Luxembourg government, that was 150 years ago, asked everyone who wanted to extract iron ore to transform it in Luxembourg, and hence there was a huge inflow of capital and an emergence of a very strong steel industry. And this steel industry then had also their headquarters here in this country and became an international group because the steel industry had no internal market, and it could only live because Luxembourg was member of the Sulfurine in the first stage. Second, because Luxembourg made the economic union with Belgium. And then when the ECSC treaty entered into effect in 1952, at that moment the big European market was really just what the Luxembourg steel industry needed. And the result out of this was that for decades Luxembourg was number 7 steelmaker in the world, and it was even at some time number 5 iron ore producer also in the world. The crisis in the 70s was a change of paradigm due to the oil crisis and due to the fact that, in fact, the European model was transformed from an industry-based economy to a service-based economy. Now the crisis of today is in fact a collapse of the economy, because what do we see today? In Europe, steel consumption last year was almost 30% below what it was 2007. And when one speaks about such a sharp decline, one needs to adapt, and one concentrates on the most effective, the most productive plants, and this is what we have done. And the consequence was that we had unfortunately to idle some plants which were not as competitive. The 2 big plants we have today, one in Differdange and one in Belval, are 2 times world leaders in the product range they are producing. Belval is the biggest sheet pile producer in the world, and from a technology point of view is the most sophisticated products. Differdange, on the other hand, are the heavy section mills, and I would say all the very big skyscrapers in the world, like the Freedom Tower in New York, are made out of Luxembourg steel.
I think the industrial policy of Luxembourg has to be distinguished. You have to distinguish 2 things: the former policy and what can be done today. In former times, you had one Minister of Economic Affairs in charge of industry, and he had a lot of instruments. He could grant state aid. He could easily put into place industrial parks. He could offer a very short and rapid administration, and he could then do also the promotion of the whole package abroad. Today you have still a Minister of Economic Affairs in charge of industry, and we see that most of these instruments that used to work in the 50s, 60s, 70s up to end of the 1980s, that these instruments don't work. Not because the minister isn't competent, but it is because due to European rules, and because other policies also got more important, that a standalone industrial policy with one actor in the government isn't workable anymore. And now to come back and try to relaunch industrial policy is maybe more difficult today than in other countries which never lost this link with its industry as we did here. But as a small country, it may be easier to come back to a well-coordinated, good approach.
I believe there is one major point to stress. That's the fact that the steel industry in Luxembourg in the middle of the 19th century laid the cornerstones of the actual prosperity of the country. And during more than a century, steel industry occupied a very particular position in Luxembourgish society by inaugurating, for instance, the whole social legislation, by constructing hospitals and so on. All these social works were initiated by the mill masters and later on taken over by the government. And there is one other fact, very particular. I don't know whether this exists in any other place in the world. That's the fact that a steel company like ArcelorMittal, for instance, played a role as a state within the state. Luxembourg was always in that very particular situation that steel industry was largely dominating all other manufacturers' activities. There was, for instance, tannery, there was still some textile industry, there was manufacturing industries, for instance, mechanical constructors, Paul Wurth, existed since the end of the 19th century. So there was indeed other industries, but nonetheless, steel industry was always largely dominating.